So this is the final of a 3-week series, and I know it's short, but it was an experiment that I think means we will do it again. But the way that we have been doing this is each of the three of us, Aaron, Andrew, and then me, have been starting from personal experience. And we do that, hopefully you have felt that, in an expression of humility, that we may be teaching on racism and the role of the church, but it doesn't mean that any of us standing here have got it all figured out or haven't had our own stumbling journey through these conversations. And I think one of the things, especially a predominantly white church needs to hear, is that stumbling through is an act of obedience, right? That learning and growing and recognizing where we have not gotten this completely right is part of our obligation to grow towards being more like Christ in this work of justice in our city, in our country, in the world. So we begin with a Google map. Stephanie asked me earlier this week if that was me on the bike. It is not me on the bike. But this is just outside of Minneapolis, Minnesota, the great North State. And this is where I grew up. I grew up in townhomes that were a mix of rental and own. It was a predominantly African-American and African neighborhood, and I don't know if you know much about the Twin Cities, but you should. No, just kidding. As is the place in many regions, churches sponsor often refugee communities to come in. And two of the biggest people when I was a child, people groups that were sponsored by churches in my community were the Hmong community and Liberians. Because of the civil unrest there. And so I had a number of Liberian neighbors, which was interesting because any of you who have seen this, African American and African populations, while often lumped together, are culturally very different. And so I was exposed to a lot of interesting insight, but I was white, if you can't tell, and I was one of the only white families in my neighborhood. And looking back, you'd think that might mean that I had special insight because I was not segregated off into a predominantly white neighborhood. But what I want to tell you today is even being around difference and even being the different one doesn't mean that being white still isn't a privileged position. And so I grew up here, lower middle class. I did not despite my nice degrees now, I did not come from a lot of money background or education. Shout out to First Gen. And this is where the bus would pick me up. And any of you who grew up in the North know that feeling. You know when you're like an elementary school student and you wash your hair and then you run out to the bus and you can hear your like hair clinking? Anyway, every time I see this corner, I think of my hair clinking as I wait for the buses. I'm like shivering and my hair is going, oh. Anyway, this is where we got picked up, and it was my whole neighborhood getting picked up at this bus stop. And when I was around 10, I have a very, you know when you have distinct yet fuzzy memories? I have a very distinct yet fuzzy memory of getting onto the bus, and from the back of the bus, someone yelling, "Hey, white girl," because I was the only white girl on the bus. And it felt like bullying, and it continued. Before that, my only bullying was, "Hey, Tombstone," when I got on the bus, which, if you do that to me, I will throw things at you. But I didn't enjoy being called out as the white girl. And eventually, my dad started driving me on the way to work to drop me off at school so I wouldn't have to be on the bus. And that memory stuck with me for a long time. And the reason I remember this memory sticking with me is because when I was in college, it was at the very beginning, so the early 2000s, of kind of racial reconciliation conversations. And part of the gen ed curriculum of kind of my mini little Baylor, Bethel University in St. Paul, was some of the gen ed requirements being around racial reconciliation, is what it was called at the time. And part of this was learning about some of what we've been learning about in this class and then writing reflection. And I wrote a reflection in my sophomore year about how I experienced reverse racism by this experience of being bullied as the "Hey, white girl" on the bus. And the title, thank you, Lord, I couldn't find the paper because I did look for it. Reading undergrad papers is painful. But I remember the title very clearly being "Hey, white girl." And looking back now, I'm embarrassed that I wrote in college a paper on my experience as a white person of reverse racism. And here's why I am embarrassed. I'm embarrassed because while that experience of being called, hey, white girl, was clearly traumatic, as I remember it, was clearly maybe even a kind of racial prejudice where I was being singled out because of my race, it is not what we would call racism. Because to experience racism means inherently that you're on the other side of those in power. As a white person, it is impossible for me to experience as the victim racism in America. Doesn't mean I can't see it, doesn't mean I can't experience other things as being white, but racism itself has to do with power. Power from the individual, but even more, which is what I want to focus on today, a privileged power in terms of systems and structure. So I know for some of you this is a rehearsal, I know for some of you it is not, but I have what is a very silly example, and I'm choosing a silly example because I do want to be clear that I am not equating this with what it means to be a non-privileged American. But to understand privilege, sometimes it's helpful to start with the silly. So do any of you recognize what this is? Any of you seen this before in your life? Do Texans have this kind of thing, or is it just a cold weather thing? It's a garage fridge. Do Texans have garage fridges? Okay, I wasn't sure, because I'm like, it gets really hot in my garage in the summer, so I don't know. So garage fridges. Garage fridges, at least my memory of them growing up, was the fridge in the garage that was dedicated to soda. Probably today it would just be filled with sparkling water, which the LaCroix is kind of sitting there. But it would be filled with soda, and I would go to my friends' houses, and we'd come home, and they would grab soda from the soda fridge. And I remember them opening the door, and it being like the gates of heaven being opened with all these brand name sodas. And those of you who grew up either with very frugal parents or without a lot of money know that brand name when you're a child is a thing. That when you can't afford or aren't given access to brand name things, you feel like the outsider. Like, remember unpacking the lunches? And I had all of the, like, Cub Foods was like our HEB, like the Cub Foods. Oh, I've got some, okay. I love having the connection here. The Cub Foods, like, off-brand of, like, the Doritos, that kind of thing. Anyway, the reason I bring up garage fridges is not just, to talk about soda, but because I grew up in a townhome that didn't have a garage connected to our house, so it was impossible to just kind of reach around the corner of a garage. And I remember thinking when I was younger, like how cool it would be to drive into a garage and get into your house, because I'd never had that. Same thing with like having a backyard. Like I'd never had my own backyard. I'd never had a fence. My first backyard was actually here in Waco when I was a doctoral student. But I never had those things. And I remember going to friends' houses after school, and they would reach into their heavenly gates of garage fridge and offer me a drink. And they were doing it as an act of hospitality. What they didn't know and couldn't have realized is that it also created this really clear distinction of difference of experience. That them just taking for granted their garage fridge with all of its plentiful soda that was cool and pleasant and nice was also a reminder to me of what I didn't have. I didn't have a second fridge, let alone filled with brand name soda. And that was reinforced in a much bigger way in that I often slept over and stayed at friends' houses rather than them coming to my house, because their parents would find ways, which my parents fully understood, of making sure their kids didn't come to my neighborhood, which was a rough neighborhood. Remember, it was also a predominantly non-white space. So I had the small things like the garage fridge. I had the bigger things like people didn't seem to want to come to my house or stay overnight. And these were examples of the privileged position of my friends. They didn't know that they had it. They didn't realize how offering me this cold soda would also be to me a reminder of the difference. They didn't do anything to earn the garage fridge. I'm pretty sure they didn't buy it. I'm pretty sure they didn't stock it. But it was just a given for them that unaware, they were in a position of privilege that they didn't realize, but I did because I was alive. Now I realize, again, this is not equating. Hopefully using such an example, it's clear that it's not equating. But sometimes when we think about white privilege, we think about white guilt. about how we feel bad or we didn't know we were doing something wrong. It freezes us up. And so much of white privilege, when we talk about it, is like the garage fridge. It's things we inherited that we don't even realize are there, that only if you don't have it are you fully aware of its existence. And there are tons of examples of this. There's a resource online, The Invisible Knapsack, if you want to look it up. I wasn't going to go through all of it because time is our enemy this morning. But white privilege is real. White privilege is also not just about the individual, it's tied to systems. It's tied to things beyond our control that we still benefit from. So I just have a couple stats, and I know stats are actually hard for me because I'm a storyteller, and so numbers get weird. So let me try to tell a story through a couple stats. This shouldn't be that surprising, but just to prove a point, especially in this moment, this cultural moment that we're in. So there was a Pew research poll sent out in 2021 that asked the question of how important or how good would it be for increased public attention to be given to the history of slavery and racism in America. So basically, would it be very good to do more of this, kind of neutral, or actually could be very bad and damaging? And hopefully some of what we've been seeing playing out in Florida about how we tell our own history reminds us of this conversation. So this probably will be unsurprising, but I think it reminds me of the garage fridge when you look at the overall stats. So the overall stats, here, I'll do it on here since we're looking at two people. You can see that. Oh, no, you can. Oh, yeah, you can. The overall stat is that over half, generally, of the entire those polled think it's good or somewhat good to talk about more of the history of racism and enslavement. What is notable is when you look at the racial demographics of who was answering, that the people who thought not only that it was not necessarily good, but potentially very bad to talk about a history of race was predominantly white folks. And those who thought it was incredibly important, look at that ratio, total of 75, 3 out of 4 Black Americans polled thought it was very good and a bit less somewhat good, but still good to talk about this past. Which says to me that those who have been without the privilege of the set-apart class who has benefited from this past history are those less likely to think it important or even potentially damaging to reflect on that history. We're not going to unpack this whole thing, but just note that those, if you will, with the garage fridges, think it's the least important to reflect on what it means to have privilege. Another one, the question of what needs to be done regarding U.S. laws and institutions to ensure equal rights for all Americans. This goes all the way back to the Equal Rights Act of 1964. We're going way back. So really enforcing what was meant to happen 50 years ago plus. How much needs to be done? And they had options. So one is the whole thing needs to be taken down and rebuilt because it's fundamentally biased. So US laws and institutions, we need to start from the ground up. Another option is there are serious problems here that we can revise within the system, that we can rework. And then there was a response of little or nothing needs to be done. We're good, we're fine. Again, the total overall was over half think that at least something needs to be done from within the system. Here's the total. And again, similar to looking at our own past when it comes to our current laws and institutions, Black Americans double white Americans polled in thinking that something, and maybe something dramatic, needs to happen in terms of giving equal opportunity. Don't worry, we're not going to live in the stats forever for those of you like me who are overwhelmed. All I want you to see is this is not just me standing here claiming things. We seem to have indisputable data that tells us that the Black American experience and how we become a better America, fulfilling the promise of America, generally seems to be different than what white Americans think would happen. And that should pose a question to us about why is it that we have such different responses that way. So Erin talked in the first class about some of the economic divides that, again, are numbers, just on the page. I wanted you to see some of them. So if you think of 100% of the net worth of all US households put together, Here's how you see this. If you can't see this, it starts in 1989 through to 2019. The share of net worth of all households occupying 85% plus with white households. So the disparity between white and non-white in terms of wealth, worth, what we have to work with, it's not a small difference, is what I want to say. It's a glaringly large one up to the present day. Income, a similar contrast. If you look at the difference between white assets and black assets of Americans, again, a stark contrast there. This goes through 2021, which, I mean, we have a global pandemic up in there as well, which is part of the drop that we see there. Per capita income, we find the difference as nearly half, but not quite half, in terms of black and white Americans. All to say, it seems that the American experience not only is different in terms of kind of soft data, I'm looking at my sociology, Chris Piper has been helping me, soft data, but even the hard data, the black experience of America seems to contrast, at least economically, different than with white Americans. Finally, overall poverty rate, a couple years ago, drastically, the black poverty rate is better. So we could say there are all kinds of causation for this. But I think what is important is that when we look at the economic hard facts and the perceived different experiences of America, the way that we start to understand what is going on is to know our own history. We start with our own history, and I heard Jamar Tisby, who we're going to talk about, speak at Truett yesterday, and he said that, and I felt like, yes. Because for me, the way that I have learned that my Hey White Girl experience was not reverse racism, even if it wasn't a great experience, was through learning about American history. Now, I don't expect us all to go out and learn about American history, but I think a good place to start is our local history. And so I want us to begin with our town, with where we live. I am barely going to scratch the surface here. There are tons of resources. Baylor has a whole report on that side of 35. There's tons of resources here. If you just search McLennan County or Waco race history in Google, you're going to find all kinds of governmental nonprofit information. So I am just scratching the surface, but hopefully what I can do here is begin for us to understand how where we come from plays out and what it means for us to be in a predominantly white church, in a predominantly white and affluent neighborhood, in a not predominantly white affluent city. So we begin back when we were enslaving people. So 1860, a few years before the Emancipation Proclamation, and as you know, we have a better memory in Texas of Juneteenth than of other places. It took a long time even post-emancipation for that to play out, but this is pre-emancipation. This is just a look at the percentage of enslaved people in Texas. And I don't know about you, but after COVID, I can identify our county like on any map, because during COVID, you're tracking it. But for those of you who weren't checking the COVID Waco updates every day, that's our county, right above Bell. We're like the little square up top. And our ratio in our county was in the 30 to 49% enslaved population. And it was around 41% in our county of people that lived here in 1860 were enslaved. It's a big number. 41%, 4 out of 10 McLennan County residents were enslaved. Notably, and again, this is scratching the surface, I didn't know this, so this is just me sharing with you. One of the training camps for the Confederate Army was actually on the banks of the Bosque River, and we sent our first troop group, can you tell I know nothing about military? Our first group of trainees out to serve actually directly under Robert E. Lee in Virginia. So we have direct ties, not only to enslavement, but to the Civil War on the side of those who at least a big part, if you read the documents, of what was trying to happen was to secede from the Union in order to continue to enslave people to make money. It was economic. To bring it closer to home, Spate Ave, in both places I have lived, I've lived very close to Spade Ave. I drive on Spade Ave all the time, both on the Baylor side and when I'm coming here to work. I'm guessing a number of you know our weirdly disjointed 35 friend, Spade Ave. So here's just a little piece. Spade is named after Joseph Spade. Joseph Spade moved to Waco in 1854. Within the next 2 years, he went from enslaving 5 to 56 people. He also helped encourage the founding of Baylor and later served on the board of trustees. He served in the Texas Infantry Regiment as a Confederate colonel, and he was part of the charter for what is now known as the Waco Suspension Bridge. You see all of those things, all of those parts of history. He enslaved people. He served in the Confederate Army. He also helped establish Baylor and built our beautiful, and helped charter the funds for our beautiful suspension bridge. You see, I want us to see that intertwining. And a pretty decent major road that many tourists even drive on is tied to this man. He's buried in Oakwood Cemetery. Some of you remember the two, Greenwood and Oakwood, over by Baylor. It was a segregated cemetery, and until very recently, I think it was like 2014 or 2015, the fence that segregated where people were buried finally came down. Anyway, there we are. So why did we enslave so many people? Waco is a weird town, as we know, for many reasons, but one of them is that we're a frontier town. And you can kind of feel the spirit of it, right? We are right as you begin to expand west, and we share a lot of characteristics of frontier towns, except for the fact that we have really fertile soil, which means that some of what the Deep South was experiencing in terms of crops and agriculture also find their way here, on top of kind of being this frontier, western, adventurous place. So cotton was a huge industry here. And I knew that, Cotton Palace is a word I know. We have a Cotton Palace castle, Cottonland Castle, just down the road that has its own TV show now. We hear cotton, but when we hear cotton, we also should hear enslaved people. One, at least in a place like this, does not go without the other. So cotton was king of the economy in the establishment of Waco and the growth of it, going from pre-emancipation enslavement to sharecropping that sprung up later. If you're curious, as I was, this is the corner of Clay and 2nd Street in 1915, huge bales of cotton. Interestingly, after emancipation and slaves are freed, those of you who don't know the history of Reconstruction, it is such a time. I would recommend even a wiki read is fine. But once Black Wacoans are free, emancipated, they begin to vote. And because so many white Wacoans went out and fought in the war, the vote during the Reconstruction era was more Black voters than white voters, which is a fascinating time. Now, can we imagine what happened? 2 things happened with more Black voters than white. One is Black people started voting for Black people to represent them. Imagine that. And so we have Shepard Mullins. How many of you recognize that name, Shep Mullins? Shepard Mullins was elected from McLennan County to serve in the Texas legislature. He was a formerly enslaved man. There was a ton of that happening in the Reconstruction South at the time, of Black people formerly enslaved, coming into positions of real power and being voted into power by the citizens and residents, including those Black men who now have the right to vote. So what that resulted in, cool, Shepard Mullins elected Texas legislature, great, but also unrest here in Waco, which led to mob violence and later we had, I think it was 4,000 members of the KKK marching on our downtown. So we had this tension here in the Reconstruction era. And some of you, history buffs, know we had the Compromise of 1877 when President Hayes said, things are really tense down in the South. We need to find a way to compromise so that we can kind of move on. And so he compromised some of the Reconstruction era goals and began to allow, rather than kind of federal mandates, states to manage themselves. So rather than enforcing that Black folks were treated now as freed American citizens, he left it to the states. And what began with the Black codes evolved into the Jim Crow era South, which was centered on keeping Black Americans from voting. That is why when we talk about voting in the polls right now, it gets so debated so quickly, is because the polls are the place where we see this continued tension happen. And so you very quickly see this rise of Black men being elected to legislatures drop. Like you can see the numbers drop as the federal troops pull out and allow the states to manage themselves. The Jim Crow era is also the height of at least the documented lynching era. Between 1861 and 1822, 22 Black men were lynched in Waco and the surrounding areas, and that is what we know about. There likely are many that we don't know about. This was not being lynched like in a back corner. These were public spectacles. These were forms of entertainment. And the most famous one, which we talked about on the first day, is the Waco Horror. It's called the Horror not by us later in history, but by non-Wacoans who saw reports come out. I'm not going to show any pictures. You can look at those on your own. But reports and photographs came out of Wacoans celebrating and rejoicing as a Black man was mutilated and tortured and then dragged through the street. So the Horror was not some woke casting back. It was horrific to those who saw it outside of Waco. And only this past week did we publicly kind of permanently remember what we are known for in the Waco Horror. So now if you go to City Hall, you'll see it's actually rather sizable. This placard that just went up, that it took 100 years after the lynching to convince the city to put this thing up, because they've been asking for it for a long time, right outside of City Hall, which is where Jesse Washington was lynched and died. And then, we're not going to get into that. But you can go there now, and I would encourage you to go there now and read the placard and stand there and look around in kind of modern contemporary Waco, remembering that crowds, high school students were let out of school early from Waco High so they could come and watch this lynching. This is not a private thing. This is not an off-the-side thing. This is our history, our place. And whatever Episcopalians were in the city at the time, we didn't exist yet. I'm sure many of them were also watching in the crowd, delighting in this spectacle of horror. Continuing on, aren't we feeling great? Continuing on, redlining. How many of us know about redlining? Right? 1930, mid-1930s to 1940s was this establishment where federal government helped in assigning kind of values to neighborhoods. And this is Waco's map. We're going to zoom in a second. But what this did is it assigned value saying whether or not a mortgage lending was worth the risk. And the main way that those values were established was based on racial identity of a neighborhood. So the more white a neighborhood was, the more likely a loan was to lend to own a house in the neighborhood. The less white, the less likely. What that means is that where people were most able to invest in home ownership was in places that looked a particular way, that tied together. So here's a zoomed in, I put a little star, here we are. There. And you can kind of see the colors a little bit, but you see this kind of green color where we are. That greenish color was the rated A. So those were, you should invest in this land. And then the blue was the grade B, the yellow was grade C, and the red, which we see some of it here, was grade E. Here's what I find incredible. Had you not shown me this map, I could have guessed, based on what I know of Waco today, what it would have been redlined almost 100 years ago. Because you can see the lack of investment in certain communities playing out to this day. And yes, some of it looks different. Like around Baylor, looks different. Around the silos now, it's beginning to look different, which is something we should ask about. Is that an investment in a neighborhood or the annihilation of one? But there's a direct link. Is it unsurprising to you that Castle Heights is a type of neighborhood? Right? Continuing on. This is just history. It's just history, looking at what happened and how we continue to see it. Here's another way we see it. In Waco ISD, we desegregated about 10-ish plus years after Brown v. Board of Education. Actually about 14. So Brown v. Board of Education said that separate is not equal, that schools need to be desegregated. It took a long time, just like post-emancipation era, for that to roll out and play out. In Waco, what happened is this newly established place called Woodway grew dramatically. So in 1960, the population was around 1,200-ish people. In 1968, so right in here, Waco ISD desegregates. 2 years later, with the next census, Woodway explodes 287%. Now, maybe that's happenstance. Woodway is a pretty established place. But if you look at the rest of the growth, nothing lines up to the explosion 2 years after the desegregated Woodway. The reason this is important for us is not to hate on people in Woodway. It's a lovely place. But to see that so much of the white wealth that was invested in Waco, in voting in Waco, and providing resources for Waco left, which is why it's called the white flight. Maybe partially in fear, but also the flight of resources and investment. So what you end up seeing, this is justice maps that Chris told me about. You can find this all there. This is the concentration. The darker the color is the more the people. Concentration of non-white residents in Waco today. So see, unsurprising, mostly in Waco. To contrast, the darker pink is white. This is the concentration of white Waco and surrounding areas population. What do we see? White flight. Still, we see the establishment of communities that continue to be invested in around the corners. I remember even when I came to interview for preview weekend at Baylor, I was told about if you want to live in one of the better parts of Waco, you really need to go to the outskirts like China Spring, Woodway. And having grown up in a neighborhood where people called it a not great neighborhood, I was immediately like a red flag kind of question. Unsurprisingly also, in light of what we know about economics, this is a map of median household income. The darker the color, the higher the median household income. So the darkest orange, which you get a little down here, is $83,000 to $106,000 a year. The lightest yellow, which we get in here, is between 0 and $33,000. We can just see in our city, in a history that I have just barely touched, the connection between investment and economics with issues of justice and oppression. That brings me to where I want to end for today. How many of you remember the shirt? Any of you? Love sees no color. Maybe this is very... It was like mid-90s, I think, mid to late 90s. These shirts started popping up that say, love sees no color. And it was this idea, at the bottom it says, racism hurts everybody. So it's the idea that for us to love well, we should see the person, not the color. This was known as kind of the era of color blindness. And people, at least where I was living, loved this shirt. Like, it was all over the place. People were all about it. You can now buy vintage tees with it. But my mom, a bit of a modern day prophet, if you're watching, Mom, this is going to be the test to see if she watched it. I'm not going to tell her. She gets a shout out. My mom, working as a teacher's assistant in a school, a junior high nearby my house, bought this shirt. Because she was really annoyed. Because she worked with students that came with all of this beautiful culture and background, but also all of this specific struggle related and tied to their race. And my mom was like, to love my students means that me as a white woman needs to not pretend like I don't see the difference. Because otherwise, I'm just seeing them as like me. Like everyone has their garage. I need to be able to love well by seeing the difference and by naming it and by addressing it. And I was trying to think of what scripture would be great. And I was going to do all of this stuff with the prophets and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, you know what? It comes down to like the most basic of things here. If we as St. Albans want to love Waco well, part of that love means we need to be able to see our neighbor as our neighbor and not just a reflection of us. And so when it talks about here, the second commandment, so love your God, which Aaron talked about, loving God includes loving those who bear his image, right? So that's all people. But part of this loving God and loving your neighbor is a summary of the law and the prophets. The law is about holy living, which includes looking out for those marginalized and not being like the other nations in terms of how we treat the outsider, not abusing power. And the prophets are all about calling out that nation who didn't do that and saying, God loves those who are oppressed and hates the oppressor. What are you doing? I don't want your sacrifices. I don't want your offerings if you can't get the most basic thing that I'm calling for, which is to not be about powering over people, but about service and love and being an example of Lamb. So I'm going to end it there. We can take a couple questions, but first I want to talk about 2 resources, because this is just the beginning. To know our history, to know why some people ask for things like reparations that may make some of our hackles go up, to understand why that is being asked and why the experience is so different, we have to be willing to learn, to stumble, to do things a bit wrong. And one of those opportunities to learn begins here in this room next Sunday. Some of you have heard about that with Sacred Ground. I invite you to learn more about it. It's in the bulletins, you know all the places. We're good at putting things in all the places. But this is an opportunity to reflect on our own history as the Episcopal Church and as Americans, especially as a predominantly white church, and where we start. And it is an investment of time, because something this important is an investment. Finally, some other resources, which I'll leave this slide up, and I brought 2 of them because I have them in my office. They're also small group books. If you just want somewhere to start in terms of reading, this one's about the history of the church when it comes to race. This one's autobiographical. There's some other the other 2 middle books are non-theology Christian books, great resources if you just want somewhere to start. But all I want to say in the big picture is if we want to be the light and love of Christ in this city, we need to reckon with the own history we have and how we benefit from that history. I'm going to stop there and I'll take that. Yes, please. Oh yeah, that's for the live stream.
Oh, I was in the military. We talk loud.
Well, it'll pick up the video.
I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
it's for the video. Yeah.
One thing you failed to mention, when you said the Emancipation Proclamation was signed in 1965.
Yeah, we kept fighting.
The blacks that were in Texas did not hear it until 1967.
That's right.
2 years.
That's right.
And you're right. Shortly after that, the Republican Party expanded with blacks. I think there was like over 1,000 blacks that they signed up.
Yeah.
And then they had white counterparts as well. And they did have representatives, black representation in those communities. I'm not disputing nothing that you said. But can I give you a testimony?
Yes,
quick, it'll be quick.
Yeah, it has to be a 1-minute testimony.
1 minute, here you go, 60 seconds. 1965, that was during the Civil Rights Movement. People were protesting, and I'm from New York. And we had our regions where we lived, different ethnicities, but we all went to the same school. So I never experienced segregation. It wasn't until I was in Wilson, North Carolina. I was coming home. Me, my wife, my mother, my father, and my aunt. We had 2 weeks we stayed in visiting his family. We were on our way back. And it was at the Greyhound bus terminal. So I went across the street. We were hungry. There was a luncheonette. Me and my father went in. It was well lit. It had nice tablecloths. And it was this one woman. I said, excuse me, ma'am, can I get a hamburger and french fries and a Coke? And I looked at my father. He said he didn't want anything. We were sitting there for a little while. Now, the grill was right in front of me. I didn't see her cooking. So I got her attention again. She came up right in front of me. And I said, I reiterated, can I get a hamburger and french fries? And she said with her southern drawl, I'm sorry, I can't help you here. You're going to have to go next door. Go next door? Why? Are you closed? My father knew. So we went next door. It was rickety stools and it wasn't, it was dirty. It had signs. If you ain't got nothing to do, don't do it here. No, you won't be served without shoes on. And I was like, oh, man. And the guy came up to me. He said, could I help you? And I was like, he had dirty fingernails, a dirty, he was a white guy.
Yeah.
Dirty apron. And I was like, no, you can't help me. No. And that was the very first time I experienced segregation.
Yeah.
Now you probably say, well, these things we don't have to worry about anymore. Well, guess what? When we talk about Juneteenth, so you see somebody with a Juneteenth on, and next time you see them, that is why they celebrate it. And we should all recognize it's not about, okay, I want reparations and I just want to be inclusive. I fought in this military. My father, my grandfather. In World War I, we weren't accepted to fight. In the United States, fighting the Germans, we weren't accepted. We had to go through France, and France recognized our abilities. So you say, yes, we need inclusion. You just need to hear our story. Mm-hmm. We belong just like you. There's no going back to Africa. No. We were born right here. We fought right here. That's it. Sorry.
Okay. No, it's great. It's great. Okay, I'm going to pray for us. I will stay here after I realize we've rushed through this series. We're just at the beginning. We're not done with this conversation. But let me pray for us. Lord God, you are the great liberator, not only of institutions, but also of hearts. Liberate us from those things that we aren't even aware that we are privileged from. Help us to see our neighbor with truer eyes. Help us to not be scared, to stumble a bit as we work towards justice. Help us to be a light and not a hindrance to your work in this city. Amen.